From the Grand Reading Room in the Nashville Public Library, this is Just Conversations, Nashville Reads How to Be an Antiracist, presented by the Metro Human Relations Commission.
Hello, my name is Robert Wilson. I'm with the Tennessee Diversity Consortium. Welcome to Just Conversations, Nashville Reads How to Be an Antiracist, filmed in the Grand Reading Room of the Nashville Public Library. I'm joined by my colleagues and friends, Kendrick Robinson with Bridgestone. He's a part of Bridgestone's diversity inclusion group, and Kelly Nowers with Awake Nashville. So I'll let Kendrick and Kelly introduce yourselves.
I'm Kelly Nowers. I am Executive Director at Awake Tennessee, which stands for Advocates for Women and Kids Equality. We advocate for the advancement of women and kids in Tennessee through education and policy change.
Great, so I'm Kendrick Robinson and I'm with Bridgestone. I provide oversight for the employee resource groups in an effort to advance Bridgestone's diversity and inclusion strategy.
Thanks. So our focus today is on failure, which is chapter 16 in Kendi's book. And so I wanted to engage us a little bit about what I thought was a really powerful chapter as I read through what was really a really powerful book in general. Just to start, about reactions, he talks a lot about the impact that racism has on societies, on individuals in the society. Oftentimes we think about racism as how it affects individuals who might be on the receiving end of racist policies or racist institutions, but I think he really takes a different look at it as far as how it impacts everyone in society. So I'll just kind of open it up to you, Kendrick and Kelly. What's your reaction to that? How do you, what did you think as you read that portion of that part about racism and how it impacts individuals? Go ahead, Kendrick.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I mean, he makes a lot of assertions about racism, but I think when he's saying that we basically repeat ideologies, they're failed ideologies, and it doesn't, and we continue to practice those failed ideologies hoping for something new. And so what happens is the impact builds over time with everyone. It's affecting all the stakeholders, the groups who maybe are being marginalized or disenfranchised, and even those folks, again, who say, well, I'm not racist, I'm for women, I'm for equity, but when you don't, it's, again, he's just like, it's really just not enough he reinforces that idea of it's not enough to just be, I'm not racist, but are you anti-racist?
Right.
So it really does affect everyone because it affects our society, our interactions with one another, and, it creates these barriers and challenges that kind of we never overcome.
Yeah, interesting. Kelly, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's so important to look at the way racism affects every aspect of the individual, not just in social interactions or the way you might typically initially think about it, but healthcare, access to resources. If we're talking about startups and business, just having the initial funding to start, to spur on innovation. I think it's you look at every aspect of an individual's life, but also what's important and what he brought up throughout the book is the way that white supremacy culture affects white people,
right.
and the people that are in those positions of power, whether we be talking about race or sex or gender, because it's holding those people to this standard that has been created a long time ago by very specific people, and I think it creates a barrier to authenticity for everyone, right? And freedom for every person, even people in power, in positions of power, in whatever aspect you're talking about that.
Yeah, there's been a lot more, I think, conversation about racism as, you've seen some hashtags around racism as a pandemic, as a way of describing it, right? And then how it has such far-reaching effects on society and impacts how people interact with one another. I also thought about it, just to add to it, I thought about it a little bit as, we know that when people interact and when people collaborate, that it creates stronger results, along those collaborations. And if there are barriers, like you kind of said, Kelly, if there are barriers that we're putting up that are artificial barriers, then that can have an impact, a huge impact on, value creation and solving problems across, different segments of society. So I think in that respect, I think he's kind of spot on when he talks about racism in this way. There were a couple of things he said that really struck me that were different ways of perhaps thinking about topics and ideas that we've kind of known for a long time. So I want to dig into both of these. It's how he defines activism as changing policy versus changing minds. Because, the work that we do within TDC, and I know the work that both of your organizations are trying to do, is a lot about education and about educating people. And there's this idea that if we just educate people, then that will solve it. And that's something that I've kind of ascribed to for a long part of my career. He talks about, activism and, are you trying to actively dismantle some of these institutions? And if you're not doing that, then, constantly preaching to people, changing minds is not going to be very helpful. What is your reaction to that one? That one is one, because it creates for me a little bit of chicken and egg scenario, because how do you get people to buy into some of the activism if you haven't done the education in the beginning? So what's your reactions to that? Because that was a tough one for me to get through.
So that question, that's interesting, because I actually, as a student of political science, I think that politics is about, gaining power and how you use that for influence. And so that kind of resonates, with the policy change, activism. And, if you think about it, I'm from Alabama native. And so for me, I thought back to like the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. So that was activism, and they were seeking, equity within the public transit system. So they weren't really just trying to change the minds of the transit authority or the citizens of Alabama. They were seeking equity within that space of public transportation. And the way they did that is with the boycott. And so they inflicted economic hardship to bring about that policy change, right? So it wasn't really just trying to change the minds of the good, well-intentioned people of Montgomery, Alabama. They had to boycott, engage in activism to bring about this policy change. So that kind of resonates with me, because the education piece we believe is important, but also I think that Kendi kind of questions that we go back to those practices that have not really worked. Yeah. They haven't produced the desired outcomes.
Yeah. What do you think, Kelly?
Yeah, I think that was one of my biggest takeaways as well, as the way that Kendi reframed a lot of these things, especially being in the space. And, the way that maybe we see corporations or organizations immediately, like the solutions that are kind of there immediately, and education is obviously one of them. And I didn't read it as, yes and no, like education doesn't do anything, but more of prioritizing energy and like within this movement, and that focusing on policy change. I guess just putting into the context of, we see leaders today that are upholding and perpetuating racist policy and then saying that they're not racist. Yeah, so there's like this, they're like, okay, something isn't aligning, or like something's not matching up. So like, what is the thing that will really change lived experience? And I think that's what he's pointing to, is like the power, exactly what you said, like the power construct and like the power that's involved in that. And then what will change that is policy and acting on that, or, protesting, demonstrating towards that.
I've actually started to move away somewhat from, when someone says something or does something, oftentimes we're quick to label them as racist. But, if you think of this as kind of a long-term, centuries-old battle, if you will, because what you said, Kelly, is exactly right. People will do something that's clearly racist in its and how it's perceived, or the outcomes it produces, but then they'll say, but I'm not racist. And then you're kind of stuck with, okay, are you or are you not? And it's a great defense, I think. So what I've started to do more of is calling out the action and not really worrying about the person, because I don't know that I really care whether the person's racist. I think that's for them and their family and their loved ones to determine. But if the policy or the action itself is racist, I think that isn't difficult to escape from, right? And then maybe we can have that debate about whether that policy is racist, but then we can look at those actions and outcomes. It's a lot easier to be fact-based, but when you're talking about a specific person, it's like you have to make this legal case, right? Well, 5 years ago you said this, and then you said this, and it's like, you know what I mean? And I'm just reaching a point where I'm okay with letting everybody else figure that out, but calling out the action, because that's ultimately the thing that's gonna, affect people. I don't know if you have any reaction to that, but that's what I thought of when you mentioned that, Kelly. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, I want to go deeper to where you went. And I love, your background, growing up in Alabama, growing up in that, definitely in that space. My father, grew up in Birmingham, so he gives me some first-hand accounts from his experience as growing up during that time frame. He talks about demonstrations versus protests. And that was another one that really struck me towards the end of the chapter. So one of my questions was, this year, there was a lot of unrest. I'm gonna call it unrest to start. And I think the prevailing nomenclature we've used is that those were protests. But Kidney goes really specifically in saying, if you've got a sign, you're walking around, that's a demonstration. And that the point there is to, demonstrate for people who may not be aware, what the dynamics of some of these challenges really are. And so it's a really, he really describes demonstrations in a way that makes them sound a lot more performative than perhaps we really think about demonstrations, right? I think demonstrations, especially the courage it takes to get out there and say, I'm going to take a stand. I think most of us have found that as a courageous act for people. But he really labels those as demonstrations, and protests are kind of what we grew up learning about in Montgomery and Selma and places like that, and Atlanta and Birmingham. Talk about that. And the question I have, in addition to just what's your reaction, is the protests themselves were so difficult for people who maybe had not engaged in this in a way. So a lot of people who were kind of sitting on the sidelines were saying, all these protests, why are they protesting? What are they protesting about? Is this really, and when you consider that, if you could think of protests as performative, the easy action, and demonstrations as the easy action, and protests really being the real work to move the needle, that kind of scares me in some way, because, if we as a society are afraid of demonstrations, how do we ever make the leap to actual protest? What do you, let's start with you, Kelly. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so kind of going back to the first thing that you talked about, I really appreciated that just clarification of language. Too, yeah. I think language is really important. I think a lot of people reading this book, hopefully but they're reading this to learn and to get involved and to understand better. So I think that clarification was really helpful. Performance is exactly what came to my mind thinking about the difference in those two, because it is easy to get swept up in, maybe for some people is a seasonal thing, right? That is not the case for everyone. But to be, let's go to this protest, let's talk about these things, and then that for that energy to die down. Right. And that does not change, that's not transformative. And I think that needs to be really clear and maybe called out for some people. And then, thinking about kind of long-term, like if there's already backlash to these demonstrations,
right.
Then what? But has there ever been a clear path to protest, right? Like there's always pushback and struggle, which is why it's harder. So I think maybe the question we need to think about, or like I am thinking about, is like, is this the right time, or how do we do it? But like, who are the leaders? Who are we following? Kind of like the strategy, like he talks about strategy a lot in the book, and changing those concepts and ideologies so that when we do come up against pushback or opposition, that we are like equipped with the right, but like equipped to know how to respond and then keep going even through that. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's just kind of like how I'm thinking about it right now. Yeah.
What do you think, Kendrick?
Yeah. So I read that over and over. Even making that distinction between the demonstrations and the protests, and just really focusing on his exact language, right? But I think that his assertion is that we conflate the two with our own peril, right? Because we use them interchangeably. But if you look at his language, what he's saying is demonstrations. His specific language is that, it's where you're mobilizing people momentarily to publicize a problem. But the protest is, so I think about that, that's like a moment, right? And so the protest is more like a movement because you're organizing people for a prolonged campaign that's going to affect policy change. So to me, that makes me think of like our civil rights movement, right. And it wasn't a civil rights moment, right?
Great way to say it, yeah.
So it's a movement, and it was the prolonged campaign that culminated in 1964, 1965, voting rights and the civil rights legislation. So you needed demonstrations to bring about the inequity in society, so you needed like twofold. We needed demonstrations, but then we also needed to activate protests, for the prolonged campaign to bring about the civil rights movement and not a civil rights moment.
Yeah. So where do you think, thinking about 2020 and kind of what we've gone through, do you see a moment or are you sensing a movement?
The jury's still out. There's a lot of debate about that right now. I'm really hoping that I have hopes that it's a movement. I think that, with the social and racial unrest of 2020, people responded. It got a lot of attention, and there have been a lot of demonstrations. But are we really moving towards a movement? Where will affect change for the betterment of society? I hope so. But I think the jury's still out on it because we're still in 2020. And then, all this stuff is taking place in the middle of a pandemic. So it's, the jury's still out for me. I'm hopeful. But I'm a natural optimist, so,
What about you, Kelly? Are you sensing a moment or a movement?
Yeah, I think we're seeing both, right? I think we're seeing both of those things happening. So he talks about the benefits of demonstration too. So they're not all performative. Like there's positive things coming out of those. And I think how I look at 2020 is that a movement has been happening, right? Beyond, before 2020, there has been a movement, and that maybe it's the demonstrating, for the positive and negative that might come out of that. It's the demonstrating that is adding to the movement that will then continue to create change. And I'm an optimist too. So this is my hopeful that, more people that are really committed and learning and doing the work are giving money to Black-led organizations, are kind of with it beyond just the protest or two, and are just kind of joining the movement of it. So I guess I'm seeing both are happening, and hopefully into 2021 it will just continue growing. Yeah.
I want to follow up, last question on something that you said I thought was really interesting. You talked about who are the leaders. And it's really interesting because, even within my own firm and activities, we kind of asked that question as well, who are the leaders? And what I've kind of put back to people is, we're it. I don't know who you're looking for, but I think people were so accustomed to, the names that we grew up hearing about during the civil rights movement in particular, that there was a group of people, led by, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, but there was a group of people that we grew up learning about. And now it doesn't feel like there are those names that you can kind of hang your hat on in the same way. Things seem more decentralized. What is your reaction to that? How do you see this? How do you see the role of specific leaders, or are we all just going to have to, pull together and work through that? And if leaders emerge, then great. If not, then we just keep, pushing ahead. What's your reaction to that?
So I think that, the names that we could really hang our hats on, they're all leaving. They're transitioning, leaving this world. So, John Lewis kind of comes to mind, and I think what he does is he challenges everyone to engage in good trouble. So I think that it becomes incumbent upon everybody to become that John Lewis or that Dr. King. So I think there's a responsibility for just your average, everyday person to become that activist in fighting racism. Everyone has a responsibility to be anti-racist. So how does that look? It might look different for different folks, but we all have a responsibility. And so we can't really just look to our true icons, he's reminiscent of Dr. King. That we have to find our own Dr. King or John Lewis within, maybe, and activate that and be the change we want to see. Yeah.
In some ways, I almost think we have the benefit of having grown up, hearing about, and it hasn't been that long since the Rosa Parkses of the world and those people. And our parents, so depending on how old your parents are, some of them are really close proximity with the legends of that period. And really, probably all of our parents have, because everybody, fortunately, was not assassinated. I mean, those men and women went on to other things that they did, and so our parents had interaction with them. So in some ways, I almost think because we're so close to that period, we do kind of have an extra responsibility to be able to pick it up and go, perhaps more than the generations that will come after us, where those people will really be people that you just read about in the book. You know what I mean? We've got a lot more closeness to them through our own experiences and our parents' experiences, but I don't know if you want to add to that or answer that question about the leaders.
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing there with what you've just said is probably a product of accessibility. So we're seeing movements in other countries and other cities across the world, what they're doing, their strategies. We're talking to people. It's like we have this connection that we didn't have when Dr. King was leading and Rosa Parks. So I think that's it's a product of that in a sense. And I think it's a good thing because we can all, we're all empowered to be our own activists and leaders. And I think that is a really positive thing. On the other hand, I think it's really important for me to know who the leaders by their names. So when we're talking, if we throw out intersectionality or race, these things that maybe become buzzwords, we need to know who are the leaders behind that and say their name. A lot of times they're Black women, and more Black women's names need to be spoken, I think. So I guess I see it in both ways, not letting the, not getting so diluted that we lose recognition of leaders, but also making sure we're empowered and we're empowering others to speak up and learn and lead when that is necessary, if that makes sense for them.
Thank you so much for tuning in to our discussion today. If you'd like more information, if you want to check out more episodes, you can go to www.justconversations.org.